Well, good morning, everybody. So nice to see all of you here in the room, and we've got lots of folks joining us online. I'm Philip Steenkamp, President and Vice Chancellor of Royal Roads University, and I'm going to be hosting the session today. I'd really like to welcome Dr. Chou, today's presenter, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Chou shortly. I'd like to welcome, of course, and share my thanks to Associate Director of Human Rights and Accessibility, Alejandro Campos Garcia, who joins us today for today's session and who organized today's session. And welcome to all of you, both here in person and online. Of course, we always like to begin our meetings in a good way, acknowledging that Royal Roads is on the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, and it is with deep gratitude that we live and work and learn on these lands each and every day. So just a few housekeeping items, and then we'll get started. We are in a room here in the Sequoia building where we actually have mics built into the ceiling, I believe. So that can work very effectively as long as only one person is talking. So I would ask the folks in the room if you could just keep your comments, well, don't make any comments. So there are questions. Okay. And for those of you online, your microphones have been muted to begin today, but you can ask questions using the chat, and then our moderator will read them out during the Q&A session toward the end of the talk. And a note to everyone that today's session is being recorded and will be available to watch after the event. So throughout May here at Royal Roads, we've been celebrating Asian Heritage Month by sharing resources and voices from our university community. And this month, we invited some of our students to share more about their Asian heritage and what this month means to them, with a particular focus on the rich traditions, diverse cultures, and creative arts that shape and connect Asian communities. Earlier this month, we were fortunate to have UBC's Dr. John Cattingall to help us think about how we grow and support Asian Canadian research, teaching, and community engagement. You can find those student voices, a recording from Dr. Cattingall's event, as well as resources and other community events on our Asian Heritage Month webpage. I really encourage you to check it out if you haven't done so already. It really is a very, very interesting set of resources available there. And for those of you online, the link to that webpage will be in the chat. So for today, I'm really delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Fred Chou, Assistant Professor, Counselling and Psychology Program at the University of Victoria, a colleague institution up the road. And today, he'll be presenting on intergenerational trauma and resilience in the Asian diaspora, specifically focusing on his own research on this topic within the Chinese Canadian community. Dr. Chou's presentation is an invitation for all of us to reflect on our relationship to the topic of intergenerational trauma and resilience, explore what collective solidarity looks like in the Asian Canadian community. Dr. Chou is a co-founder of the Victoria Migrant Mental Health Network, which brings local mental health practitioners and academics together to support the mental well-being of migrants. As a researcher, Dr. Chou specializes in qualitative and participatory research with a particular focus on storytelling. In response to the surge in anti-Asian racism at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, he was part of a team that created an anti-racism zine for youth. Among this and his many other projects, he is also leading an ongoing project, Stories That Shape Us, which explores intergenerational resilience in Chinese Canadian families. Through interviews with parents and their children, the project explores how families adapt and cope with adversity. The stories are co-created with participants and shared within the parent-child relationship, helping to strengthen their connection and mutual understanding. Dr. Chou, we are so grateful to have you here to speak with us today. I'd like you all to join me, Cock in the background, join me in welcoming Dr. Fred Chou.
experiencing that peacock sound. Happens quite a bit at the university. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present about a topic that's near and dear to me as a researcher and as a clinician. Just wanted to thank Dr. Steenkamp, Dr. Alejandro Campos Garcia for creating this space and hosting this. I also want to thank Royal Roads University for this really important work that this community is doing for supporting Asian Heritage Month. Not just this year, but also previous years as well. There's also been previous talks. And so this really important work that this community is doing. And I'm thankful, inviting me to be part of this. Just some information. I really appreciate that introduction of myself. My Chinese name is Delman Ho. I was born and raised in Edmonton in Treaty 6 territory. My parents are from the Guangdong province, so I'm a second generation Chinese Canadian. When I think about this topic of intergenerational trauma and resilience, it is a relational topic. So I may have those fancy titles of associate professor and psychologist, but that doesn't really matter to my 5-year-old and my 2-year-old. I'm just dad. So I really think about it from this relational standpoint. I'm a son, I'm a father, I'm an uncle, and I'm a husband. And these relationships matter. And so I present this topic, not just as a researcher, a scholar, as a clinician, but from these relational lens that I think really, really matter quite a bit more than the professional titles. Appreciate also the land acknowledgement. I do also want to acknowledge the traditional lands of the Lekwungen peoples and the Songhees Esquimalt nations. Coming from the University of Victoria and where I am situated, I also want to acknowledge the Westanish peoples as well. Land acknowledgements for me are really important, especially when we're thinking about the topic of intergenerational trauma. You're probably familiar with the term historical trauma. And so when I think about the land, I think about the role of colonization and the continued impact of colonization. And so for me, doing the land acknowledgements is also an act of resistance. It's an act of resistance in terms of resisting the discourses that may try to silence. And there's a bit of a common theme when we think about intergenerational trauma around this topic of silence. And I'll touch upon that in just a bit. Asian Heritage Month. It's such a privilege to be able to talk during Asian Heritage Month. It's a time of celebrating Asian folks. But with that, I also want to acknowledge this concept of forced resilience. So we are acknowledging and celebrating the work of Asian folks in Canada, but also recognizing there's a context and hardship that Asian folks had to also endure. And so we acknowledge both celebration and also the hardships and losses. With that, I also want to acknowledge Lapu Lapu Day that happened last month and the events and atrocities that happened and the losses of the community. We continue to feel the reverberations of those losses. And so it's important to acknowledge that, the ways that it impacts our Filipino Canadian community, our local community, and the broader Asian Canadian community. If you hadn't had a chance, Dr. John Paul Cottingle also does an acknowledgement of Lapu Lapu Day. 2 weeks ago, there's a presentation that he had done. So if you hadn't had a chance to watch that, please watch that. And he talks about this idea and the importance of memorializing those events as it shapes our histories and our histories of Asian folks in Canada. So I do encourage you to check that out, and it's posted through the Royal Roads University website. So I'm a psychologist and counselor by trade. I much prefer conversations. What I often tell my students is I'm interesting for about 30 minutes and I get really boring afterwards because my trade is much more about talking and I much prefer listening. And I like asking these types of reflective questions. So when you think about hardships, adversities, and or traumas that your parents and family face, how does that shape your identity? How does that shape your understanding of your cultural community? So I invite you just to think about these questions as we go through this topic. And it's a really broad topic. I won't be able to cover everything. Asian diaspora is kind of big. We're not a monolith and we're kind of big. So there's a lot to cover. And so I won't be able to do that justice. But again, each of us have different relations around this topic. And so I invite you just to think about this as we are talking about intergenerational trauma and resilience. Can folks hear me at the back? I'm not sure if I'm projecting. Okay, excellent. I had the privilege, my research team and I, sorry, it's a little bit small, but I'll read it out. My research team and I wrote a book together with participants developing stories of intergenerational resilience in the Chinese-Canadian diaspora. This is from the book, Stories That Shape Us. And this incorporates these stories that were developed together with the participants, as well as our reflections as authors, as researchers, and their own responses. Incorporates stories, as well as artwork and poetry. And I want to present this poem first to really highlight the nuances of intergenerational trauma. That is, it's not, sometimes when you think about the term, it feels very broad and all-encompassing, but there's nuances and there's meaning making that's associated with it. So I want to read this poem that's written by one of the authors in the Stories That Shape Us. Eldest daughter. I was invited into this world with the responsibility as eldest daughter, invited to bear the title of being a daughter who should be well-behaved, obedient. A title I resist, I shake, but stays. Make a mistake, I am struck with dishonorable pain. Moi moi imitates my attitude, I am struck with paralyzing shame. That is hurt, I am struck with eternal guilt, because I am invited into this world with the responsibility as the eldest daughter. The use of clothing hangers will be taught as objects to hang garments, not strike when I invite into this world an eldest daughter. I wanted to define some of these terms first before we jump into this topic. The terms trauma, intergenerational trauma, historical trauma gets used quite often in our everyday discourse. And so I think it's important to just kind of help differentiate. So sometimes when we use these terms a lot, it sometimes loses its meaning. And it's important to understand that there's a clinical perspective as well as a non-clinical perspective. There's a social theory around trauma, as well as kind of specific to kind of clinical perspectives as a psychologist and how I deal with, this work with the clients that I work with. Trauma, the term, when you think about it from a clinical perspective, this is diagnostic statistical manual kind of lens, where this is the exposure to direct or indirect to near-death experiences, serious injury, or sexual violence. Everyday language, you tend to think of this as really highly distressing events or a series of events. It's important to understand that folks who experience trauma do not necessarily become traumatized. That not everyone who's experienced trauma is traumatized. And this idea of traumatized is really this constellation of physical, psychological, and relational states of being as a response to trauma that could affect somebody. And usually when you think about terms like post-traumatic stress disorder or acute stress disorder, you see this constellation of avoidance, of reoccurrence of memories, or kind of emotional distress or emotional dysregulation. And I want to kind of keep that in mind, because sometimes we kind of think about this idea that somebody's exposed to trauma and somehow everyone is traumatized, and that's not necessarily true, at least from a clinical standpoint. Then we have this concept of intergenerational trauma. And at the basis of this is the idea that the parental generation experiences trauma, often to the extent of traumatization. So you could diagnose a bowl with like PTSD and things like that. Then there's a transmission of this trauma through parenthood, communication, epigenetics, and kind of a mixture of these factors that affects the subsequent generation in terms of how they make sense of their experiences psychologically, or sometimes in terms of mental health challenges. The concept of intergenerational trauma originates actually from Holocaust researchers in Canada, that they were looking at kind of the effect of the Holocaust on families. And so at its core, really kind of was looking at these really broad scale collective traumatic events like war, like the Holocaust. You can think of it more clinically, and there's this concept called the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And this really is kind of focusing more specific within family groups. And so you can see it from this diagram itself, kind of that second half. this idea around intergenerational transmission of trauma. Then you get terms like historical trauma. And historical trauma and intergenerational trauma as a term, they kind of get used interchangeably because actually it kind of at the core of intergenerational trauma was really referencing these large-scale collective traumatic events. Indigenous researchers applied this concept of intergenerational trauma to look at the effects of these large-scale traumatic events on their community. So they termed this idea of historical trauma, not only to identify one singular event, but many events, the ongoing project of colonization, not just the Indian residential schools, other events as well. So you have these large scale events that are kind of continuous as well, affecting a people group that have a shared identity. So you think of historical trauma, a bit of a social theory, but it has a kind of a clinical perspective where you can have a clinical sense of intergenerational trauma within historical trauma, as well as a non-clinical perspective as well. But at its roots, kind of shares a lot of parallels in the world of intergenerational trauma. So I'm going to kind of bounce between the terms as I'm going through our presentation, and that's because that's the way the literature tends to treat this. Then you have concepts like resilience. And resilience, and so before just kind of going back a little bit, this it's also kind of important to recognize that historical trauma has this really broad impact, right? So if this is a diagram from Dr. Lawrence Kiermaier, a psychiatrist at McGill University, kind of talks about this idea that trauma from a broad stance, this collective trauma affects nationhood, community, family, and then distills also into individuals as well. So it has this really broad focus in terms of the impacts of these types of collective historical events. Then you have the concept of resilience, which is the process and outcome of successfully adapting and overcoming hardships and traumas. And then this concept of intergenerational resilience and the ways in which resilience is modeled by parents. It's usually used as a bit of a flip side to kind of intergenerational trauma and recognizing that there are also resilience processes that happen in families that's being modeled, that's being communicated, that's being shared from one generation to the next, not just trauma. So what does this mean in terms of the Asian diaspora? And again, I can't cover all of these events, but when you look at the 19th and 20th century in Asia, there are some really large-scale atrocities that are happening across the different countries. Things like the Japanese-Chinese War, things like the Khmer Rouge shooting. So these really significant events that are happening that affected large amounts of peoples during this period of time, this tumultuous period of time. And this sense of commonality around these type of events that kind of propelled this movement of migration towards other countries like Canada and the US. This is a table that's presented by Chai and Lee, or researchers, and they kind of applied this concept of historical trauma to the Asian diaspora and kind of pointed out that there's also this commonality of Western imperialism that's associated with some of these events as well. So again, can't touch upon all of these, but just the recognition that there are these really grand events that affected large groups of people that has also kind of contributed to this mass movement and migration, that there's these hardships and difficulties and this desire to seek a better life, some of it as refugees, some of it as immigrants, etc., to try to find a better life for their family. Yet and the other piece that I also want to touch upon, there's this pre-migration trauma and these collective traumas. And then there's also the post-migration hardships as well. We are kind of familiar with the histories of anti-Asian racism, xenophobia, legislations around anti-Asian racism, such as Chinese head tax and things like that. So not only do you have those hardships prior to moving, pre-migration, you also have this post-migration, that this is where you get some of the terms like racial trauma. What's interesting is that there's a sense of silence around these events. There's and again, not a universal experience, but a common experience around Asian diasporic folks, the second, third generation. Whereas these things has happened, but people aren't really talking about it. Family members aren't really talking about it. What led me to have my interest around the topic of intergenerational trauma is when my grandfather passed away. And, at the time, training to be a psychologist, I was doing all this research on trauma. I was doing all the genograms, my own reflections around my own kind of, identity. When you go through counseling, you constantly do a lot of reflections, and didn't really kind of connect the dots that maybe my grandfather was traumatized. Actually, I learned a lot more about him afterwards, things that he's gone through in terms of the Civil War in China. And so this interesting piece around this silence, around somebody who was near and dear to me, essentially a father figure. I grew up in an immigrant family. He was the one that was kind of taking care of us. And this person who was so near and dear and close to me, not really recognizing that maybe he was traumatized. Maybe those nightmares I had when I was growing up was actually night terrors associated with traumatic events. But I will never really know. So this really kind of led me to this idea is, why is there so much silence around this topic? And when you look at this literature, there's this concept called conspiracy of silence. Dr. Rachel Yehuda was looking at Holocaust survivors, and this seemed like there's this constellation of circumstances that contributed to the silence around this hugely traumatic event. Families weren't taking it seriously, communities weren't taking it seriously, professionals weren't taking it seriously, and it seems like this conspiring to keep silent around this really significant effect that has affected the community. And we see this commonality of silence also in the literature for the Asian diaspora. Silence observed in the Japanese internment camp survivors, silence towards the survivors of the Cambodian genocide, the Korean War, narratives associated with Chinese political turmoil. There's this concept in literature called the post-victimization traumata. Sometimes that response to the trauma often, and if it's not done well, often makes things worse. And that's usually what I tell my clients when I'm working with them through their traumatic instances, that our responses sometimes make it worse. The trauma is hard enough itself, but the silence and not taking it legitimate is that much more worse. So what is this kind of associated with when you look at the Asian diaspora? There's this concept called organized forgetting, that maybe there is this intentional erasure of the past as a way to pursue this North American dream. We don't talk about the stuff that's happened. I know these are things that my parents often say to me. We don't talk about the things that happen. It doesn't matter. We are here. Life is better now. You need to be successful. This chasing of the North American dream while kind of denying realities of what's happened historically. Maybe there's linguistic and cultural barriers. It's loss of language, loss of culture that comes with migration. I know my Cantonese is very poor. I certainly wouldn't be able to talk about these types of circumstances with my parents. Requires a little bit more nuance in language. So there's also that loss of language that may be associated with it. Talking about traumatic events itself is also incredibly part of that constellation is avoidance. It is difficult. It may also bring up a lot of shame. So there's maybe silence associated with this. Maybe it's also an act of love. This idea of protecting family members, this act of benevolence. Oftentimes in the Western lens of trauma theory is this idea we have to break silence. And sometimes silence itself is an act of resistance. Sometimes silence itself is an act of care. But what you find is this sense of knowing and not knowing, or what I like to call this loud silence. And the subsequent generation knows that something has happened. Maybe they're piecing things together. They're observing things from their parents. They're piecing together things that they learn, they're coming across. And how come no one's talking about that? How come there's an elephant in the room? I'm not sure if people watched Encanto. We don't talk about Bruno. My children are young, 5 and 2, so let's do that a lot. Maybe too much. But I think about that, like there's this character that's contributed to this kind of shame related to the family, and nobody talks about it. Everyone's talking about burnout. Everyone's talking about these things, but everyone's talking about it in its own way. And there's this intersection, this model minority myth, and I've kind of alluded to this already, this organized forgetting that we have to be successful somehow. We forget about this past, and by silencing the past, unintentionally or unintentionally, kind of allows the perpetuation of meta-narratives, otherness of Asian folks. They're familiar with this concept of the perpetual foreigner, the model minority. This is a direct quote from Nagata, who quotes Chai Li. It says, "The US-based narratives about historical trauma minimize atrocities experienced by Asian Americans, such as those occurred during the Korean War." And so this idea that by not being able to tell our own stories, others can tell stories about us without us. So we, Asian Canadians, there's also a bit of a bind around our mental health and historical trauma. There's cultural frameworks in terms of mental health that are not the same as our mental health discourses in North America. These tend to be shaped by Western North American discourses in terms of what mental health is, this discourse around what wellness is. That's not the same in different Asian countries. It's a different cultural worldview in terms of what suffering is, different cultural worldview in terms of what wellness is. I think about my own parents for the longest time, and they still don't really know what a counselor or psychologist is. They don't know what I actually do. Like you talk to people and you make them feel better. How does that work? Either. And they're like, you became a professor, so you're finally doing a legitimate job. And so there's a sense, and I joke about that, but there's a sense in terms of this different cultural understanding in terms of what wellness is and what psychology is and mental health is. So there's this disconnection. Then there's the deep double stigma, that the challenges of living as a racialized individual in a predominantly white society, as well as the stigma of mental illness. Then there's the model minority myth and the idea of preserving face. We don't talk about issues outside of our family. We protect our family. We also need to protect this image of success, imposed or not. Some of it is imposed externally. Sometimes it also gets internalized as well. And what you find is this constellation around silence and model minority myth, which contributes to this mental health disparity. This perception that somehow Asian folks are all a monolith and all somehow successful and therefore don't really require mental health support, which is untrue. But what you see is our mental health systems are designed in a way that don't really support the unique cultural needs of Asian folks. Asian folks also, there's literature that shows that difficulties, going for professional help around mental health. So not only do you have a different cultural worldview around mental health, as well as these stigmas and these barriers, our systems are then designed in a way that doesn't really support Asian folks. And so creating this disparity, despite the literature showing similar levels of distress as other cultural groups as well. So where does that kind of begin to shift things? When we begin to bring up this concept of intergenerational historical trauma into considerations of Asian mental health, our experiences, it begins to provide a bit of a lens, being able to interpret experiences. Yeah, trauma is not the only way to interpret experiences, but it hasn't been really talked about that much. When you look at the psychology literature in terms of Asian American, Asian Canadian folks, typically it's acculturation, intergenerational family conflict, and it almost seems to be removed from the historical business. Right? Psychology tends to treat things in this way where it kind of treats these kind of essentialist kind of psychological constructs and removes the kind of history behind it. And it gives us another lens of understanding. So I really think of this as a narrative discourse. Think about my own experiences, where think about things that my parents have done and some of their own behaviors. And always kind of wrote it off as just the immigrant experience. They used to collect a bunch of like shopping bags. It'll be like a whole closet full of shopping bags. So this is when they're plastic. You know, now they don't collect them because you have to pay money for it. So and they used to collect whole mounds, and I used to just think that was just the immigrant experience. And when I began to think of this from a trauma lens, maybe it was also a response. Maybe it was a response of survival, their own experiences of having to survive, whether that's intentional or not. It begins to give us a different way of understanding things, and a different way of, I think, also humanizing, I think. So with my research, I draw from Dr. Robin Fabush and this idea of this narrative ecology model of the self. And the way we understand our own identities, our own experiences is through stories that's shaped by broader cultural narratives, that's shaped by family narratives, that shapes who we are in terms of how we understand our own selves as beings. And what you find is this interesting piece where there's a silence around these events. So there's these remembered traumas. There's some traumas we're allowed to remember, some traumas we're not allowed to remember. But then that's passed on to subsequent generations. And this sense of disconnection, this sense of there's something missing as the subsequent generation tries to kind of make sense of things with these kind of pieces of the puzzle that are not fully kind of outlined. So where does this kind of leave us in terms of how do we respond about this? So we've established this idea, historical trauma, generational trauma is part of our diaspora, and recognizing that that is a reality that affects a good portion of folks here. When we throw out the term trauma, sometimes we kind of think this is purely a clinical condition, or the people that have to solve it are the psychologists and the counselors, which is great. It's good for my business, but that's not true either. When you look in terms of historical trauma, there's a mapping of different approaches of looking at historical trauma that lends itself to different ways of intervening. So you can look at it from a clinical perspective. And that means it's more of an intrapsychic thing. And this is where I talked earlier about this idea of clinical and non-clinical. And yes, there's clinical thresholds and may kind of lend itself well to more psychotherapy and clinical interventions. But there's a good portion of folks that look at intergenerational trauma from this idea of the lifestyle. That is the distal determinant of mental health, that the processes, generational and historical trauma, disrupt cultural processes, disrupt our understandings of ourselves. So actually this requires more of kind of cultural resilience, building up health and community resilience. And there's folks who kind of look at this from more of a social theory lens. We can look at this from a critical discourse in terms of how these large scale events affect a broad people's group. This is the domain of social cultural. And this actually means the role of resistance, reshaping our discourses. What's quite unique and quite there's obviously some sharedness across all these, but the opportunity to recognize that all of these approaches share an opportunity to be able to address things like historical and intergenerational trauma. It's not just one particular lens itself. It requires all of us. And I want to touch upon this idea of collective solidarity. It is in my title, so I probably should have to touch upon this. There's this concept of the tripartite model of collective psychosocial resilience. And some researchers, in response to anti-Asian racism at the time during COVID-19, kind of talked about this idea of how we channel these experiences towards our own collective resilience, our own collective good. So we apply this lens to historical trauma, recognizing there is this sense of shared understanding, histories of trauma and adversities. There's some commonality. Obviously, every country and every people group is slightly different, but there is this commonality, and this commonality that's propelled this kind of migration. That is shared. We can understand that. There's importance of then being critically conscious of the ways that that contributes to systemic inequities. Things, as I touched upon earlier, like systemic racism, institutional racism, the way that historical trauma intersects with that. And from there, understanding that and moving towards advocacy. There's also a place for critical and intentional remembrance. So if you think about this idea of organized forgetting, there is a role as a way to respond to that, critically and intentionally remembering the historical events that have shaped our communities. And when I think about collective solidarity, I kind of gain solace in recognizing this whole concept, whole group of Asian diaspora, Asian Canadian, Asian American. This was actually more of a political entity. That this concept kind of formed during the 1960s as part of racial justice movement. So part of this commonality as this concept of Asian Canadian actually has been historically resistance. Historically, this idea of needing to come together despite the differences across different Asian groups. And when you look at the geopolitics of Asia, which is a whole nother lecture, that's a profound thing to think. That somehow, despite all these potential differences, that there is a sense of needing to come together that's been part of our identity. And locally, so some examples, think about, for instance, like the Chinese student strike in Victoria in 1922 against segregationist policies, that we have this history of resistance that's part of how we see ourselves as Asian folks. So I'm going to go through just the mapping of these different approaches and just some examples. These are imperfect examples. There's a lot of other examples, but there's limited time, so I'll try to cover what I can. If you take it from a clinical perspective, then we're looking at this from this idea of historical and intergenerational trauma as a narrative discourse. You could think of it as an idiom of distress, a way of interpreting and understanding the distress that we are experiencing. This then highlights the importance of culturally responsive care and the role of storytelling. And what you find in the commonality in the literature, the importance of storytelling, the importance of testimony as a way of critically remembering and as a way of witnessing. Kind of coming back to this concept of trauma and traumatization, it's important to note that telling one's traumatic experiences can be traumatic and traumatizing itself and could contribute to secondary traumatization. And so when we're thinking about clinical interventions, there's the importance of scaffolding, being able to create conditions to be able to tell stories well from a clinical standpoint. So some stuff that my research group has worked on, we developed a group called Reclaim and Connect. And this is a group therapy or group support group that focuses on storytelling, that's focused on specific core themes around the racialized experiences, racial identity of Asian Canadians, to be able to connect back to their own heritage and their own experiences around topics like racism and model minority, parental expectations, and to be able to connect with other Asian folks through storytelling and witnessing. We've also developed an intervention called Recultivating Family Stories, which is a kind of a self-facilitated guide, which kind of gives this scaffolded reflective process of kind of exploring your own story. So there's just examples. And of course, there's many others that are out there that are trying to address the effects of historical and intergenerational trauma through clinical intervention. Then there's community resilience. Again, this idea of that trauma, historical trauma, disrupts cultural processes. So this highlights the important role that cultural centers and cultural communities have in terms of uplifting this historical knowledge as well as culture and maintaining culture. So I think locally, like the Victoria Chinatown Museum, and the really important role that they have related to recognizing history and storytelling. I also think about the Japanese Canadian internment camp tours, where they bring together these tours of folks, bringing them back to some of these sites where the Japanese internment camps were, and inviting them to share through healing circles about what it's like to be in those spaces. And then I think about reshaping discourse. There's this really important term that I want to highlight called survivance. This is from the Anishinaabe theorist Gerald Visioner. This idea of applying kind of a bit of a resistance or pushback around historical trauma. This idea that, Indigenous folks are not just survivors, but they are actively resisting and living in generative ways that are also to be celebrated. So again, coming back to this idea of trauma, and not everyone's traumatized, it's important that we also think that yes, historical and intergenerational trauma is part of the picture. But Indigenous folks, Asian folks are not just survivors. There's a whole bunch of traumatized folks. And we're also existing and resisting generative ways. And also think about this concept of intergenerational joy. That there is part of this picture, again, resisting this idea, I talked about historical trauma and the importance of intergenerational trauma, but also importance of just resisting this idea as well. And that there is also joy in intergenerational relations. I think about that my parents have as they interact with my children, the joy that I have in moments of connection with my parents, connection that I have with my own children. So as we think about reshaping discourse, it's important to kind of keep and hold that there are other types of ways of interpreting this concept of intergenerational trauma, historical trauma. With some academic examples, some really interesting work that's happening. Dr. Drexler Ortiz did some work on intergenerational colonial mentality in the Filipino community. Rebecca Zhao did a dissertation on graphic narratives of Chinese-Canadian intergenerational trauma. The landscapes of injustice over at the University of Victoria, recognizing the circumstances of the Japanese-Canadian experience in internment camps and its continued effects. There's also the Asian-Canadian Asian migration studies at UBC, as well as the Asian psychology section, which was formed this past year, trying to uplift Asian voices and recognize the importance of addressing the psychological needs of the Asian community and addressing things like this mental health disparity. Then there's really important community advocacy that's happening, that's shaping our discourse. Coalition Against Anti-Asian Racism, the Colty Collective, storytelling for and by the Asian diaspora community. Against the Tide of Racism is a podcast that's hosted by my friend and colleague, Dr. Tina Ko, which tells stories of racism and resistance to racism and these calls to action. And coming back locally, the Chinese student strike, there was a 100-year anniversary march in 2022. It's a way to recognize that event as a way to call to action around racial justice. So I'm going to kind of bring this all together. Yes, there is the common experience and this opportunity for us to come together in solidarity. There is critical remembrance. And there's also an aspect of reclaiming. The research that I did around intergenerational trauma and Chinese Canadians, there's this piece of reclaiming that the subsequent generation found their own unique ways to connect to their own culture and heritage that may not have looked exactly like the ways that their parents wanted or the way that culture wanted. They found their own ways to reclaim while honoring their own experiences and their parents and cultural expectations. And I think, as nebulous as the term historical intergenerational trauma is, it has real impacts. There is opportunity for a multifaceted way to address it, what you see already happening in our community, whether that's coming from an intrapsychic, personal, or social-cultural perspective. So I just want to leave off with this poem, again, from the same author, from Stories That Shape Us, which I think is quite nice because it touches upon this piece about reclaiming. Coming home. Name I am called each day. It was found in a dictionary. Dictionary, a word too long for my parents to know in English. Why did you give me this name? Easy to pronounce, daughter. I don't want your experience to be uttered foolishly like mine. Hoi, he, words that don't exist in the language that holds half my identity. Hoi, the victorious return of a ship after war. E, signifying happiness from the heart. Meanings that become lost if not asked about. This is the reason why I named you Hoi E. I hope for my first daughter to return home happily after leaving home for marriage. Marriage, no reason to leave home without shame. Chose shame. It was not for marriage, but for reclaiming. And now I'm coming home happily. Battle beside me. Some resources to explore and discussion.
Dr. Chou, thank you so much for a very powerful presentation. I know we've got about 15 minutes if there are audience questions. And there was an extraordinary amount of material there. So for those in the room, obviously just raise your hands. We've got mics here in this wonderful room, so people will be able to hear you. If you are online, just a reminder, please to write your questions in the chat and the moderator will read them out. And I guess that's you, Lisa, today. Great. So are there any questions either on, we got a question online. Why don't we start there, please?
So this person asks that when you're explaining historical trauma, it sounds like you're describing complex trauma. Are you using those interchangeably, or could you elaborate on that?
Complex trauma is different. Historical trauma really refers to more of that broad scale collective traumatic events. Complex trauma, from a clinical standpoint, you're referring to kind of individual ongoing traumatic events that happen throughout his lifetime. So you have simple PTSD, singular traumatic event, the organization. Complex trauma, from a clinical standpoint, refers to kind of multiple traumatic events that's happened throughout a person's lifetime that contributes to this emotional dysregulation clinical standpoint. So it's different. I can see where there's some understanding, because we also think of it as like, you know, these multiple broad scale collective events that happen to a group, which I guess see where there's kind of some understanding of this potential parallels.
Well, thank you very much for such an amazing, very engaging presentation. I have a question on silence.
Yes.
For more than silence, I have a question on silencing. Because now when we live in a time in which, you know, there is a clear project of silencing those stories, those reflections, those traumas, those storytelling, those numbers. Basically, you see even the removal of books from libraries, the removal of data collection strategies, the removal of policies in order to really count and identify and make things visible. So how do you think, we are at the beginning of this in many ways, how do you think this silencing project is going to really connect to re-traumatizing or enhancing trauma in itself? Because when you are not allowed to speak about those things, really that's going to have an impact at all, emotional toll, socio-cultural toll, interpersonal toll. So that's my question.
That's a big one.
Yeah, I know.
And I have to be careful because, you know, even though I kind of go into many different types of multidisciplinary perspective, my position is from counseling psychology. That's my main discipline. So I'll excuse me if some of my perspectives are a bit limited. I think what you see here is this, I don't know how to describe it, but even though there may be efforts to silence, that there's ways in which historically we continue to resist. I think there is an impact. And I think you see that in some of the narratives that I've explored, where this sense of disconnection, sense of knowing and not knowing. But I think it kind of, there's this itch in some ways that there's something there. And I think it's important from a sense of identity to be able to have this sense of connection and making sense of things. So generationally, you see that already happening, that there have been silencing associated with intergenerational historical trauma for the Asian diaspora, and that there's a people group, generations that are trying to find ways, connect and uncover. I don't know, maybe this is a bit of an optimism and hope, but I think there's always these histories of being able to push back and claim and resist. And I think about, like, for instance, like the Holocaust research. I remember hearing something where it's like, for the longest time, the effects of the Holocaust and the impact of the Holocaust was just like a singular line in the history book. And it really was kind of the subsequent generations that were kind of understanding what happened to their parents, kind of unfolded this really important work around the Holocaust. And you have large, vast amounts of literature around the Holocaust now. In a sense, efforts that silence or continue to try to silence, I think I'd like to be hopeful that they may always fail. That there's a collective will to be able to resist that. May not be in one generation, maybe in other generations.
Anything more?
Not at the moment.
All right, please.
Hi, thank you for a beautiful presentation. I loved the three-part response of the self and culture and discourse. I find that to be just a good project for myself in some way in exploring these types of things. So my question is, I have someone I love very much who has experienced significant intergenerational trauma. And as a writer and in counseling is working through that. But in working through that, and going back and finding those stories and talking about them, also is finding a point where she's also seeing the ways in which her family inflicted in some way intergenerational traumas on other groups of people, and is finding kind of a double silencing guilt, shame reaction, and it's quite complicated. And I wondered if you had any insight on that as from a counseling perspective.
Oh, goodness. What have I opened up?
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
It's
beautifully
complicated. It is complicated. So I don't think my response will do this justice. I think part of this is having to sit through that discomfort and acknowledging that that is the reality. That by uncovering things, there may be things that we are not. There may be reasons why it has been silent, and I think part of making that and in doing that exploration is kind of making that transparent and making that clear and having those full challenging conversations. You know, and you look at, for instance, so I touched earlier in my presentation, you know, why is there this shaping of discourse? Well, a lot of these events in Asia, there's a Western imperialist violence. So of course, there might be this desire to silence that. And if you look at Asia, there's a lot of geopolitical violence across different Asian countries. And of course, there's a desire to silence that. And so part of our role is, I think, trying to find truth. And in doing that, we have to find ways to reconcile that in ourselves. And that's an ongoing journey that requires grace and care. And I also think part of the work that by kind of naming things from a trauma perspective, I think there's also a humanizing too. There are some of these atrocities that happen because we are part of these systems that we may not have chosen. So it's important to also humanize that. Not necessarily to say that that's right. There's opportunity just to humanize that. So I have a longer conversation, but that's kind of my Cole's notes.
Beautiful, thank you.
Lisa.
I have two questions here, separate ones from our online audience. The first asks if you can recommend any meetups or groups. This person has said they're a second generation Chinese, Japanese, Canadian, recently moved to Victoria and would like to connect, listen and share and meet with others. What recommendations might you have?
I think there's a lot of these really great groups, like for instance, the Victoria Chinatown Museum. Do a little plug in for them. That's top of mind right now because we kind of did a presentation and covered them. But I do think there's a lot of these other societies as well. And also kind of touch upon the Japanese Canadian one as well. I think, you know, I have a little bit of a bias towards some of the group therapy stuff, but again, you know, if you're not really requiring or wanting group therapy because of its clinical focus, then you don't necessarily have to go that direction. And this is where I kind of mean like there's multiple directions in terms of kind of connecting to heritage, and it could be through a clinical lens, but also can be through these really important work that's already happening in our community. So yeah, I can't think in the top of mind other groups. I think I touched on some of them. Some other groups are like Cold Tea Collective. The Living Hyphen is another really great group that's not local, but it's in Canada. They also do a lot of really neat storytelling around racialized experiences.
The second question that I have here, this individual is looking for your thoughts on how first or second generation Canadians or even international students who are studying here can navigate their own personal traumatic experiences.
Yeah. I think part of it is also differentiating if there is like a clinical threshold. So if it is at a level that feels very distressing, and it's affecting one's mental health, then yes, I think it is helpful to kind of draw upon some mental health supports like counselor or psychologist. But I also think there are also a lot of similar to that previous question, there's a lot of really great work that's being done in different communities. That those are some of the resources, local resources, you know, organizations like Intercultural Association locally are also found really great work that they're doing. Different kind of clubs that are happening on campus. I'm not familiar with the ones at Royal Roads, but UVic also has a lot of really great clubs as well. So I think those are just opportunities and spaces to begin to find ways to connect to heritage, culture as a mechanism of healing itself. And of course, if it's kind of a threshold where it feels more so, and that's where perhaps a counselor or a psychologist may be really helpful in exploring some of those.
But you, there's huge complexity in what you presented. It's wonderful.
I tried.
But I've just been thinking about, Canada as a country and these waves and waves of immigration. And most waves of immigration are from people who've been fleeing something, often fleeing something, persecution and conflict, bringing trauma with them, and they've got that intergenerational trauma. Then many of those waves have become part of systems that in turn have traumatized Indigenous Canadians, right? As well, and just the complexity of dealing with those different levels of trauma, that guilt shame thing I think you were talking about earlier is fascinating. And then you talk about solidarity as well, and how I'm thinking about Japanese-Chinese solidarity is fascinating given the history there as an example. But Indigenous, solidarity with Indigenous people who've suffered their own trauma. And which traumas you privilege and all of those kinds of things. This isn't a question, it's just occasional line because we are running out of time, but just to say you've given us so much to think about, so much material here. And putting it in this framework, I think has been incredibly stimulating intellectually for us. I just wanted to thank you so much for being here to help us reflect during Asian Heritage Month as well on intergenerational trauma and resilience and exploring what solidarity really does look like. I also want to thank Alejandro, of course, for organizing, the communications team, multimedia services as well for supporting the event. I want to thank everybody in the room today, but I know we had lots and lots of people online as well. Thank you for bringing your questions and for spending time in this space with us during this very significant month of reflection. So with that, if we could just join in a round of applause for our